Alright guys, I'm here back with a new video, and in this video, I'm back talking about the Life is Strange series once again. We're with me now having finished a retrospective on every game in the Life is Strange series. I've decided to make another video on the series here, where here I'll be ranking every episode in the history of the series. Now, funnily enough, one of my first videos on this channel was an episode ranking of the original Life is Strange. Or at that time, all that was released was Before the Storm and a few episodes of Life is Strange 2 that I hadn't played yet, so I decided to just keep it condensed to the original game. Yet here we are now with 5 episodes from the original game, 3 episodes from Before Storm, and also the bonus episode Farewell. We have Captain Spirit and the 5 episodes of Life is Strange 2, along with the 5 chapters of True Colors, and also the DLC Wavelengths. And through that, we have 21 episodes that we could potentially rank here. And through that, I decided it's finally time to get around to ranking every episode in the series. So obviously this will all be based around personal enjoyment here, where if you've watched my retrospectives, you'll probably know which games I like more than others. And through that, some of these placements should not be shocking, though I'll obviously be running through them all anyway. And let's start off at the very bottom. At number 21, the worst episode in the Life is Strange series to me is easily Before the Storm, episode 3, Hell is Empty. And again, I feel like I've talked about this numerous times now, how just much of a disaster this entire episode is. Like, I think this episode is literally a series of some of the worst and most melodramatic moments in the entire series, back to back to back. We literally start off with the backstory around Rachel's mother, and then we get the entire segment at the junkyard where Rachel Amber is stabbed in the arm. We have Elliot stalking Chloe and having this massive shift in his character, and him essentially entrapping her in the Amber house. We have the investigation in the Amber house where we learn about Rachel's father planning on killing Rachel's mother, and that's ridiculous. We have the reveal that he's been working with Damon the entire time, and the final confrontation with Damon and how it connects back to the original game is all really stupid. And also the final outcome of the game and revealing this to Rachel and ramifications of that are all also really stupid in comparison to the original game. And again, just in general, that's my biggest issue Before a Storm, is how bad of a prequel it is. But even when we're looking at the individual aspects of this episode, it's just constantly filled with melodrama in a way that just makes the entire episode come off as really ridiculous. And while there's some decent moments here and there, particularly in the downtime between characters, the overall main plot points of this episode are a complete disaster. And because that's, for me, it's here at number 21. Now, number 20, moving on to another game in the Life is Strange series that I've very openly not liked, and that is Life is Strange 2, where here we have episode 4, Faith. An episode that just feels like it goes completely off the rails, where to me, Life is Strange 2 has always been a season that really just struggled with focus. It seemed like a season that most of it felt like it just meandering towards its eventual goal. But episode 4 for me is the one that really epitomizes this, as really the entire episode has us having to reunite with Daniel, which is a decent concept, but the way that we get there is through a lot of pointless and again over-the-top aspects of the story. And when it's not over the top, it's really boring. Like at the hospital, that entire section just goes on for way too long, and then we get Daniel being assaulted by the racists in the middle of the night, and that's ridiculous. We get the entire cult storyline, which is also just extremely over the top and just really bizarre that this happened in a Life is Strange game. And as a whole, again, this is just another pretty big disaster of an episode. I will say the only thing that keeps it above Before the Storm, episode 3 for me, is the fact that I think at least the concept of the episode is interesting and really testing Sean's bond with Daniel and how much he wants to reunite with him, and also introduces Karen to the story, who could have been an interesting aspect of the story, though again really isn't at the end of the day. So yeah, I think there's like more good ideas here, though again it's botched execution in my mind. Still leaves it here at number 20. Number 19, we're moving back to Before the Storm, but not a main episode, instead moving on to the bonus episode Farewell, which I will say straight up, I do have a tough time really assessing this episode, because I think on paper, again, it is a cool concept. It is this farewell to Max and Chloe, and through that you get a lot of these nice little moments between the two. Getting to explore Chloe's room and sees mementos of their relationship. Essentially, you have this final day with Chloe before Max ends up moving, and all that is really great conceptually. However, one, I feel like gameplay-wise, it doesn't really do it in an interesting way. It's kind of just us walking around the house, house and the attic and the backyard, and particularly the entire hunt for the treasure, which isn't particularly interesting. And really the biggest criticism is just, again, narratively, it doesn't make sense. And again, I talked about this in my retrospective, and again, there are justifications for how this fits into the timeline. The issue for me is the fact that you have to jump through so many hoops to get there. Just feeling like, again, the writer's not having any regard for how this connects to the original game. But also, we get the most ridiculous scene in any narrative-based game I think I've ever seen in the final farewell between Max and Chloe, where Max literally leaves Chloe at her father's funeral, only to then plan on not talking to her again. It's really ridiculous. Again, it's all really, really bad. So again, I think it's another episode that has good ideas, but the overall execution just feels very messy. Though again, I did very much consider putting this a bit higher, mainly because of the focus on the Max and Chloe relationship, though I just feel like the ending is just so incredibly botched to where I left it here at number 19. Now number 18, moving back to Life is Strange 2, which this back and forth between the two games might be a trend early on the list here. But at number 18, we do have the final episode, episode 5, Wolves. An episode that, straight up, I just find mostly boring. I mean, I do think most of this episode is just not particularly interesting. The entire stuff around the Hermit Town is just kind of dull. Again, introducing these characters that simply don't matter and won't matter. The entire stuff with David Madsen is cool on paper, though really doesn't add anything of any true significance to the story. And despite the episode picking up more when we get to the border, even then we get the over-the-top nature of the interaction with the vigilantes, who are obviously racist, because obviously have this skit with Daniel, to where the one main pro for this episode, and the reason why I did put it above Farewell, is because I do feel like the different amount of endings are kind of interesting. And while I do think a couple of the endings are kind of underwhelming, I still overall like how they handled the endings in Life is Strange 2, especially in comparison to Life is Strange 1. Even though, again, it's still not fully ideal, I like they at least included more impact from your previous decisions. And again, I do like two of the specific endings, the Blood Brothers ending and the Redemption ending. So again, there are some positives here, though again, most of the episode is just still pretty lackluster, which leaves it here at number 18. Now at number 17, who guessed it, we're moving back to Before the Storm. So where here we have episode 1, Awake. An episode that, for what it is a solid introduction to Before the Storm. My issue is that it's still Before Storm, which I just don't particularly like. Now, again, there is this focus around the Chloe and Rachel relationship, which is endearing at first, though again, in connection to the original game, I don't feel like it fully works. And I think it strips Rachel Amber of the mysterious nature that kept her character interesting in the original game. Also continuing to show Chloe as not super likable despite these attempts to humanize her. But again, most of the episode is simply just fine. Again, it's a lot of these initial interactions with these characters. And some of them new, like Steph and Mikey, you got Drew, while also introducing us to some of the characters from the original game, to which the connection to those characters, again, don't make sense in comparison to the original game. Particularly characters like Victoria and Nathan. So I think that aspect of it is a mixed bag. And again, plot-wise, the episode as a whole is just kind of just fine. It doesn't really do that much outside of just introducing the Chloe-Rachel relationship. Though I will say the final scene itself is pretty ridiculous, with Rachel screaming as she causes a wildfire. But again, it's largely just a okay introduction to Before the Storm, which lands it here at 17. At number 16, we're wrapping up Before the Storm already. And here we do have Before the Storm episode 2, Brave New World. An episode that I know is pretty well received from the Life is Strange community. This is an episode that is pretty well liked, and I will say, yes, it is the best Before the Storm episode, but that's not saying much. One, I do think this episode is just extremely drawn out. I do feel like this is an episode that goes on for way too long, and while it does have some of the more notable moments of Before the Storm, particularly the play scene, you have the potential for Chloe and Rachel to have their first kiss, and these are nice moments. However, really the rest of the episode is just not that good in my mind, and it's filled with the same issues that bog down the rest of Before the Storm. Yeah, a lot of moments of Chloe coming off as unlikable, a lot of moments that don't really make sense within the original game. Again, the interactions between Chloe and Victoria don't make sense. The interactions between Chloe and Frank don't make sense. The stuff involving Drew and Damon doesn't really make sense. The stuff at the beginning of the episode where Chloe could potentially get expelled is also kind of dumb, as we know she gets expelled at some point, so why even make it a choice? You have annoying gameplay bits and you trying to fix up the car, and the entire setting up of the table at the Amber house is really dumb. Along with the fact that we get the final reveal, the shock reveal that the woman that James kissed was Rachel's mom, which is a mind-blowing reveal when you first hear it until you realize how stupid it is and how it doesn't really play off of the initial scene of us seeing them kiss really at all, as how's that justify James kissing her? And again, this episode is still just filled with the same issues as the rest of Before the Storm, but is, again, I guess slightly better. So it is here at 16. Now we're 15, and again, with us being done with Before the Storm, guess what? We have a lot of Life is Strange 2 here, and we're going to be continuing on here with episode 1, Roads, which I do think is a decent intro to Life is Strange 1. I do feel like it is an episode that, while people complained about its slow start, I did feel like it had some decent setup here, and showcasing Sean's relationship with Lila, Sean's relationship with Daniel, Sean's relationship with Esteban, his father. While again, the overall death scene for Esteban is just, again, over the top, as most of this game, I actually don't mind how the game is initially set up. However, again, I do feel like the overall downtime of Daniel, while again it is good conceptually and how it's bonding you to the character of Daniel, I do feel like it does come off as pretty slow in its execution. And again, we still get the really over the top scene of the gas station owner locking Sean up and us having to escape there. But again, I do feel like this episode sets up the concept of the game pretty well, and focusing a lot on the Sean and Daniel relationship, along with introducing this road trip nature to the story, particularly in us meeting up with Brody, who is the first of these characters that come in and out of the story, which is an issue with the game, but I do feel like here it doesn't come off as big of an issue. And overall, again, it is just a fine episode. It is a fine introduction to Life is Strange 2. It does what it needs to do decently well. Some of my main criticisms here come from, again, how over the top certain scenes are handled, but overall an okay episode. It's here at 15. Now number 14, we're moving on to another Life is Strange 2 episode, this being episode 2, Rules. An episode that, coming into this list, I actually expected this to be the highest Life is Strange 2 episode, as I feel like that was my interpretation coming out of my last replay. However, the more I thought about it, the more I do feel like this episode's kind of bogged down by a lot of just kind of fluff. There's a lot of time that you spend at the Reynolds house, and a lot of that comes off as kind of pointless. There's also a lot of tedious tasks at the abandoned house at the beginning of the episode, and really, it feels like an episode that has a lot of wasted potential. To me, it feels like they could have done more of the character of Chris. I was underwhelmed with his role in the episode, and really a lot of the episode just comes off as kind of pointless, though I'm too fair. That's a lot of Life is Strange 2. Now again, there are some decent plot developments here, particularly in introducing Karen's later involvement, though I do still feel like the episode just feels like it doesn't really do much to progress the overall story. And again, it's just an episode I am just largely conflicted on, to where when I think of Life is Strange 2, to be honest, this is one of the first episodes I do think of. However, I think when I think about my overall experience with the episode, it simply just isn't one that I look at that fondly. And because that, for me, it's here at number 14. Now number 13, who would have guessed it? We're wrapping up Life is Strange 2 already this early on the list, essentially wrapping up my two least favorite games in the series before the halfway point in the list. But at 13, we do have Life is Strange 2, Episode 3, Wastelands, which again, coming into this, I did not expect this to be the top episode from the season. Now, coming into my last replay, it was my favorite episode of the season. However, when I replayed it, I kind of came out of it a bit disappointed. Not necessarily because the things I liked about it I didn't feel were there anymore, but more so because it is this relatively unimportant aspect of the story. I think out of the 5 episodes of Life is Strange 2, I think this episode is the one that progresses the overall plot the least, where you spend the entire chapter at the pot farm working for Meryl in an attempt to gain money to get a Puerto Lobos, money that doesn't really end up having a major effect on the story moving forward, where the only true plot development from all this is your separation from Daniel, though it is kind of that also makes me really like this episode, because I think this is probably the only only episode in the entire season that feels really focused. While most other episodes in the season just feel like this mix mash of random events happening and random characters going in and out of the story, while here we spend the entire episode with this specific group, this group of hippies, living alongside them, getting to know the characters of Finn and Cassidy, having these choices that allow us to grow closer to one of the two and potentially romance one of the two, being this nice coming of age story for the game, and the fact that Sean can end up in a relationship 1 to 2, which does again feel like it hits these coming of age tropes that you would expect this game to hit. Well, even beyond that, again, the entire episode still focuses on our events on the pot farm and our confrontation with Meryl, and all this I do think is again a relatively focused story here that is simply just not really there for the rest of Life is Strange 2. So it is because of those aspects I do kind of respect from it that it lands here at the top of the Life is Strange 2 episodes at number 13. Now number 12, we're moving on to finally a good game in the Life is Strange series, though still my least favorite episode from that game by quite a bit, and that is Life is Strange True Colors Chapter 5 Side B, the final episode in Life is Strange True Colors, and one that I do think is overall a pretty big letdown. Is an episode that is largely focused around these flashback / dream sequences that really explore Alex's backstory, which I do think is a nice backstory, but one that I do think is just told in a really boring way here. It's told just through a series of dream sequences back to back to back that I do think just kind of harms the overall pacing of the story. I think it would have been much better if these were interspliced throughout some of the previous episodes, not just all clumped together here. And also a lot of this episode ends up being extremely linear, where it's really just going from dream sequence to dream sequence, which can also be just kind of boring. Now I will say I do think the game's conclusion and this confrontation of Jed at this town meeting is a really nice way to wrap up the game, where while I am still underwhelmed with how little of an impact the way that you handle Jed really has on the overall story, I did still like how your choices beforehand affected who supported you and who didn't, even though again that doesn't really matter that much. But it does feel like this nice test of your previous choices, this nice culmination of the choices you've made up to that point, which it is this final sequence here that kind of elevates this episode in my mind, as again the first half or so of the episode, these long dream sequences are just getting kind of boring to me. However, I do think that final confrontation with Jed and also the actual outcomes themselves are all pretty solid, which is what lands here at number 12. Now number 11, we're keeping with Life is Strange True Colors, going to the other episode that I'm not the biggest fan of, and that is Life is Strange True Colors Chapter 3 Monster or Mortal. A chapter that when I initially think of it, I do really like it, because I do think the main thing you remember this episode for is the LARP, which is, while not that important of a section to the overall plot, it is a really fun section of the game, one that is still really cool that they went out of their way to develop this miniature RPG inside of a Life is Strange game. And again, it is a really fun section of the game, along with the fact that it also does at least play into Alex's character. It shows her going out of her way and putting this event together in order to try to cheer Ethan up. Again, this nice development of her character. Now, the reason why this episode is still relatively low on the list is because really the rest of the episode, which I don't like as much. I do feel like the beginning of the episode involving having to trick Diane in order to steal her USB drive, like all that is just not super interesting. So again, it is nice to see it play off of Life is Strange 1 and us doing this investigation with our friends. But also, I don't love the ending of the episode either. This entire section with Charlotte, which comes off as pretty over the top and doesn't make Charlotte come off as a particularly likable character, though I also didn't like how this affects the following scene by you doing what seems good on paper and relieving Charlotte of her anger ends up leading to Alex ostracizing her friends, which is just kind of strange at how the game handled that sequence. But again, like for me, this is kind of just a mixed bag of an episode, as I do feel like it contains one of my favorite sections in the entire game, that being the LARP. But I feel like everything outside that is just kind of mediocre. Probably some of my least favorite stuff in True Colors, at least outside of Chapter 5, which makes it a bit tough to rank here, but I did end up landing here at number 11. Now number 10, we're moving on to an episode that I think is kind of tough to rank. I mean, really, this and the next episode are very, very close, both being kind of special episodes in the series, being these mostly self-contained experiences, though how to place them was very difficult, as I feel like they are in the same ballpark for me. However, at number 10, I decided to go with the DLC for True Colors, that being Wavelengths. a DLC that obviously revolves around Steph, you playing as Steph during her shifts at the record store, and this is kind of a mixed episode to me, where I do think there are some great moments here. I mean, one, it obviously allows you to connect more to the character of Steph, one that does come off as pretty likable, though kind of one-dimensional through the course of Before the Storm in the main game, though I think she is given a lot more complexity in this game. I did love the reintroduction of Mikey and us getting to see her relationship with Mikey, and all that is really, really great. However, the rest of the episode is us doing tedious tasks around the record store, like organizing shelves or putting away decorations or answering phone calls and reading ads, and all this is just kind of boring. And again, that is my dilemma with this episode, as I do think there is some great stuff, probably better stuff than what is in the following episode and how this DLC handles Steph's character, but I think this episode also has major downsides, particularly in how its gameplay loop is just not particularly interesting to me. However, it is still a really strong episode, one that I do really enjoy, and because that is here at number 10. At number 9, moving on to, again, a similar episode, similar status in the Life is Strange series, not being part of a main game. However, here we do have The Awesome Adventures of Captain Spirit, obviously being this kind of tie-in game to Life is Strange 2 that was released for free before the game, kind of this demo. And Captain Spirit is a game that the first few times I played it, I really did not get much out of it. I thought it was fine for what it was, following Chris, this character that, again, came off as fine. And it did tackle some pretty dark themes in terms of parental abuse and grief, and I recognized that, though it wasn't until my more recent replay, the one I did for my retrospective, that I really gained an even further appreciation for this game. I do think it is a game that I think captures the essence of Life is Strange even more so than the entirety of Life is Strange 2. It is one that really plays off this theme of nostalgia extremely well, but kind of in a different way from Life is Strange 1, where obviously in Life is Strange 1 it's more so focused on Max looking back at her previous life on Arcadia Bay, while here it's more so based around how that makes the player feel, and that is essentially putting the player back in this position of being this kid on a weekend morning, getting to use their imagination around the house to keep themselves entertained. And I really love that aspect of this game, but again, it also does tackle these pretty dark themes. Now, again, I don't think it pays off those themes as much as I personally would have wanted it to, but I still think it does a pretty decent job at introducing these themes in a way that I thought was going to get paid off in Life is Strange 2, though it doesn't. But again, I do think this episode does a lot of good stuff. I do love the mini open world that you're given here and all the tasks that you're able to do. I do love how it handles and us seeing Chris being struck with grief over the death of his mother and getting to learn more about her, and also learn more about his dad, who again is abusive towards him, and we can unravel the pieces of their relationship. And again, just overall, I really like this episode and grew further respect for it more recently, and that's why it's here at number 9. At number 8, we're moving on to an episode that finally has us touching the last game I haven't talked about yet, that being the original Life is Strange, where here we do have, from Life is Strange 1, Episode 5, Polarized, the final episode, which I've talked about in the past, I think is a massive mixed bag. I think it contains some of the best moments in the history of the series, particularly the final confrontation with Jefferson, obviously the final choice, even though, again, I think one choice is better than the other, where I think sacrificing Arcadia Bay is just kind of ridiculous, while I think sacrifice Chloe is a much more satisfying outcome that really pays off Max's development over the story. But the issue, though, is, again, kind of similar to True Colors Chapter 5, which obviously that took inspiration from this episode. A lot of this episode is either in flashbacks or in dream sequences, and it makes the overall episode feel kind of disjointed, how much you're flipping back and forth between timelines, and how really a lot of it just comes off as this massive puzzle section of you trying to figure out what exactly you need to do to progress through the story. And again, a lot of that can come off as a bit tedious, along with the fact that the entire nightmare section towards the end is just kind of dumb, and I never particularly liked it, as like really dumb stealth sections and some just kind of boring puzzles. So again, it's definitely a mixed bag of an episode. I still like it more than most episodes. Obviously, it's still part of season 1, and it's an episode I do have a decent amount of reverence for, though I still feel like the holes in it and and largely how unfocused of an episode it feels like is what kind of leaves it behind here, number 8. Now, number 7, we're keeping with Life is Strange 1 here, going to an episode that I believe I've gone down on since I did the episode ranking all those years ago, and here I do have episode 3, Chaos Theory, an episode that I'm kind of just mixed on overall. To me, it's like the thing that really stands out of this episode that does make it as good as it is the focus on the Max and Chloe relationship. The fact that we have this lengthy section of them starting the investigation to Rachel Amber and them breaking into the principal's office and then them sneaking off into the pool, and that's all a really nice moment. I feel like the first half of this episode is really, really strong. The problem is the back half of the episode, which is not as strong, where the stuff back at Chloe's house is just kind of boring to me. And overall, the stuff with David never felt too impactful, while the stuff at the diner with Frank is all just really stupid, and how convoluted the overall puzzle mechanics of that section are. Also, the stuff with Pompidou is really stupid, where you could literally have him getting hit by a car, which is dumb. And again, Chloe comes off as largely unlikable towards the end of the episode, and even then we have the alternate timeline stuff at the end, which is a cool reveal, though, and also comes off as really over the top. And just again, it's an episode that I think the first half is really great. I think the back half, though, is just really lacking, and it's kind of tough to rank here, but I did end up going with number 7. Now, number 6, we're keeping with Life is Strange 1 once again, now going to the beginning of the game with episode 1, Chrysalis, an episode that did jump up in my estimations a bit recently, in the fact that while this is the first episode, and through that is obviously kind of a smaller scaled episode, is one that does a lot of introducing the overall story, but obviously doesn't expand beyond that in the ways that future episodes do. I do feel like it still is a really strong opening. I think it's an opening to the season that I really don't have any major issues with, which I think is the reason why I definitely elevated it on the list here, to where I feel like, unlike most of the episodes we've talked about so far, where there's at least like a major criticism at some point along the way, I don't really have that with this episode, outside the fact that it is smaller scaled. And again, I think it does a really great job at allowing you to get introduced to a lot of the characters in the game. Obviously, the important ones that you're forced to meet over the course of the story, but also the ones that aren't mandatory. Where again, this is an episode that is largely skippable. There's a lot of optional content in this episode, a lot of characters that you don't even have to talk to. Though, if you do, you obviously get to know a lot more about them, and I do feel like that's an aspect of this episode that I really respect, just how much optional content there is here. And where if you take your time and talk to every character, this episode could take you up to over 2 hours. Well, just playing it straight through, you could easily finish this in less than an hour. And the fact that this episode is widely variant, I do think is something that I am overall impressed by. Now again, like most criticisms with this game, and there are some choices here that don't really matter that much, like the overall decision on whether or not to tell Wells about Nathan, and I guess the overall puzzle section at the dorms is kind of convoluted as well, but I still find this to be a pretty solid opening episode to the season. Again, a great introduction to the Max and Chloe relationship, and playing off these themes of nostalgia, great introduction to the time travel aspects of the story, and as a gameplay mechanic, and just overall, again, I feel like this is a very solid episode. Great introduction to the series, and because that is here, number 6. Number 5, we're finally moving away from Life is Strange 1 to return to Life is Strange True Colors, where here we also have the first episode of this game, that being Chapter 1, Side A. An episode that I really do love. Again, it fills a similar role as Life is Strange 1's first episode, where it's really you having this series of moments of you getting to know these new characters and introducing you to Haven Springs, this location that very much feels like its own character. Now, I will say it is handled a bit differently than Life is Strange 1, where all these characters are mandatory to meet, and you are forced to be introduced to these characters along the way, unlike the original Life is Strange, though. Again, I do like the overall premise of this episode and how it handles a lot of the character introductions. And really, most of the beginning of the episode is this trek alongside Gabe and getting to the Black Lantern, where you'll be staying, though along the way you get introduced to its inhabitants one by one by one. And this also does a great job at introducing Gabe to the story, who obviously you're supposed to bond with over the course of episode 1, to where his later death at the end of the episode is made more tragic and really propels the rest of the story moving forward. And really, I feel like that is part of what I love about this episode, is how much it really allows you to grow close to the character of Gabe, only for that to be stripped from you by the end of the episode. Now, again, I would handle his death scene a bit better in my mind, where I do feel like his death just comes off kind of anticlimactic and just kind of comes off as a little bit funny. But I feel like there's a lot of strong content here. Again, some great character introductions and overall great start to the season, because that's here number 5. Now number 4, we're moving back to Life is Strange Season 1 for an episode that I think is probably one of the most notable episodes in my mind, though again is still a pretty flawed one, which is what leaves out the top 3. And here we do have episode 2, Out of Time, an episode that I do think does some really great stuff. Again, it further bonds the characters of Max and Chloe and really has us testing out Max's time travel powers, which again is cool on paper. Now, one of my major criticisms of it is the execution of it, and the fact that I do think the overall gameplay of it is just kind of boring. The entire scene at the diner of you having to use the time travel mechanics to tell what's in Chloe's pockets, and then us having to tell Chloe what's about to happen, and us having to watch the scene in reverse time in order to make the guesses, and all that's just really boring. And the entire stuff at the junkyard is also kind of slow, and again, the tedious fetch quest to find all the bottles, which again, I get the point of it, and it allowing you to learn more about the Chloe-Rachel relationship through your finding of the bottles, but it still comes off as a pretty tedious aspect of gameplay. And then beyond that, again, you obviously have the Kate Marsh stuff, which is probably one of the most notable scenes of this game. This scene of you having to stop Kate Marsh from jumping, which again has some pros and cons. I think the pros are obviously the fact that it's a very emotional moment and one that has some cool little bits to it, and the fact that if you had looked around her room earlier in the episode, you'll be able to learn information about her that'll help you in the conversation. Really though, I do still find a lot of it just really over the top. I do feel like a lot of it just comes off pretty heavy-handed and also just kind of contrived, in the fact that Max just so happens to lose her powers in this one instance that would stop her from being able to save Kate, and then just instantly regains them pretty much right afterwards. I think all that's kind of dumb too. So again, it's definitely a mixed bag of an episode, but I do think the pros outweigh the cons, especially on paper, where I think conceptually it's probably one of the best episodes of the season, though it is those nitpicks there that leave it here number 4. At number 3, we're moving back to Life is Strange True Colors, where here we do have a nice lead into the finale of the game, that being Chapter 4, Flicker. An episode that again has these nice parallels to episode 4 of Life is Strange 1, which maybe we'll talk about soon, and having some of the best moments for this game. You have all the events at the festival, which feel like this parallel to the end of the world party, which essentially has these farewells to a lot of the characters that you came across this game, while also having this nice character development for Alex and her coming out of her shell by being part of the performance at the end of the scene. You are essentially able to pick your love interest over the course of this episode, and that leads to the rooftop moment, which is pretty nice if you pick Steph and kind of awkward if you pick Ryan. You obviously have the Jed reveal at the end of the episode, which is great, even though again kind of foreshown, but still a great parallel to the Jefferson reveal in Life is Strange 1. And again, a lot of this episode are these parallels to episode 4 of Life is Strange 1. I do think it works pretty effectively here. Now, again, I still feel like those beats hit harder in Life is Strange 1 than they do in this game, where this game, it does feel very much like this imitation of it, but it's still well done. Though I will say this episode does come off as pretty short, where it is easily the shortest episode of the season, probably one of the shortest episodes in the entire Life is Strange series, which is definitely something to note here. But I think as a whole, a pretty great episode that does perfectly lead into the finale of the season, though again it's kind of small scaled, which leaves it out of the top 2 for me. And now number 2, and again for me, this top 2 were the definitive top 2. I think these are easily the 2 episodes that stick to my mind as the best Life is Strange episodes. However, there's a major distinction between the 2, where one of these episodes is probably one of the episodes where the most happens. A lot of the biggest moments in the history of the series happen in one of these specific episodes, while the other one is probably one of the most focused episodes in the series, telling this really focused narrative from beginning to end, and really has very few flaws. And it was a tough choice between the 2, and straight up, my number 2 pick should be the number 1 pick if I'm going from a purely critical standpoint. However, I'm deciding to add in my personal bias here, and through that, at number 2, I do have Chapter 2 from Life is Strange True Colors, Lanterns, which again, I think is actually the best episode in the Life is Strange series. I think it's an episode that is written extremely well, really focusing around the character of Alex Chen and further developing her character, telling this focused story from beginning to end, starting off the episode and her being unable to speak at Gabe's wake and seeing the people around her filled with anger over Gabe's death. And through this episode, she's finally able to use her powers for good, being able to turn this anger into joy, showing the strength of her powers and really connect to the people of this town, to where we culminate this episode with this perfect final scene of her finally being able to speak about Gabe's death, giving this speech as they raise the lanterns in remembrance of him. And all this is just so perfect. I love how this episode is handled. I love how this episode develops the character of Alex Chen. Now, I will say, again, gameplay-wise, there's a couple nitpicks, particularly the flower shop sequence, which I think is kind of tedious. And also, like, certain scenes probably go on a little bit too long, but it's still a really strong episode that tells a really focused story and is really the episode that makes me think of Alex Chen as the series' best protagonist. For sure being the most developed protagonist of the bunch. And it's just an episode that overall I have a lot of respect for, which is why it's here number 2. Now, number 1, the best episode in the Life is Strange series is one that I think has a really massive flaw, which is the reason why I struggled with putting it at number 1, especially over my number 2 pick, which I think is a near perfect episode of the series. But at number 1, the best episode in the Life is Strange series to me ends up being from Life is Strange 1. It is episode 4, Dark Room, which, as I mentioned, has some of the best moments in the entire series. It has the culmination of this Rachel Amber investigation, which leads to your final interactions with Frank and Nathan. It has the finding of the Dark Room and the finding of Rachel Amber, which is this really emotional moment. You get the end of the world party, this great farewell to all the little side characters in the game. And you obviously get the ending of the game, the Jefferson reveal, probably being the best moment in the entire series, being this great twist ending to this episode, to where along with the death of Chloe at the end of it, it really ends up being this fantastic lead in to the final episode of the season. And I think everything from the point that you start the investigation to the end of the episode is just brilliant. And if it was just that, this would by far be the best episode in the Life is Strange series. How the reason it's close, though, is because of the alternate timeline stuff, which is just straight up boring. To me, it is so boring, it is so melodramatic, and it is so long. And to me, this is the main criticism of this episode. This is the reason why it's close between this and Chapter 2 of True Colors, is because of how sluggish the alternate timeline aspect of this episode is, and how pointless it really is. It really feels like it's there just to add more melodrama to the story. Oh yes, I understand what it's trying to do in terms of showing Max the potential downsides of her powers and teaching her the lesson of that you shouldn't be messing with time travel. It's still executed in a really boring way of these long, mopey conversations between Max and Chloe that simply just don't matter. You get this choice at the end on whether or not to put Chloe down. Again, a choice that also doesn't matter. And really, again, it's just a boring sequence. Now, again, outside that, it is the best Life is Strange has ever been. So many iconic moments all in a row, particularly the finding of Rachel Amber and the Jefferson reveal. Really, really great moments there. But again, it is that beginning section that does make me question its status as the best episode in the series, but I still decided to land it here simply because of how great I found this episode during my initial playthrough. But there we go. That is my ranking of every episode in the Life is Strange series, which in a way is my wrap up of what I have to say about the Life is Strange series. Now, obviously, for future Life is Strange games down the road, I'll do videos on them whenever a new one releases. Though I will also state that I kind of have another Life is Strange video that I do want to do at some point down the road. I've already mentioned this before, but I would like to redo my original Life is Strange retrospective and do a really deep dive into the game, kind of a similar way to what I did with The Walking Dead Telltale Season 1. So again, maybe expect that at some point way down the road, but for now, that is the video. Thank you for watching.